Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is special as we are joined by someone who's no stranger to Cultural Caravan, Dr. William Seraile, Professor Emeritus of African and African American Studies at Lehman College. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you.
Well, please, we were talking about basically looking at the status of African Americans, particularly from a historical perspective, and you'd raised a question about culture versus condition. Can you please explain?
Well, I've done a lot of research in the 19th century, and I think a lot of the issues that we talk about today were discussed and examined back in the 19th century, and what kind of solutions should we find or look for to solve those problems. And one thing that struck me was something that I read, and it was someone wrote that we have a condition in common, but not a culture in common. And my interpretation of that was, at that time, our condition in common was slavery, disenfranchisement, segregation. So in a sense, we were together because we had to be based on circumstances. But once some of us began to escape slavery, and slavery ended, poverty still remained. And so if we don't have that culture, and how do you define culture? It's many different things that makes up one's culture. It could be religious values, it could be income, it could be education, so forth. If we have those things in common, then we can say all of us can make advancements together, as opposed to, well, I'm not a slave anymore, I'm not worried about your condition. My condition is different, I'm going to escape economically or socially and so forth. And that's the reason why sometimes people pass who could just to get away from the community.
So when you say passing, can you explain to the audience what do you mean by that?
Well, historically in America, if someone looked like an African, they were an African. But because of miscegenation, or we call mixing of the races, some of us didn't look like Africans, we looked like Europeans. And those people, if they chose to, could pass into white culture and white society. And therefore, they're in a way escaping, what they call mulatto escape hatch. They're totally leaving the racial identity of the majority of us. Now, my concern is this: if we don't have a culture in common, and again, we define culture by many terms, such as religion, common values, common morality systems, common educational goals, attainments, and so forth, we stick together. And so historically what we have done, we've had different prophets, whether it's Booker T. Washington or Marcus Garvey or Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm X or others who would say similar things. Why don't we have economic power in our own communities? Now, I never heard anyone saying in Chinatown, why don't the Chinese have economic power in Chinatown? Or in Little Italy, or Little Russia, or any other ethnic community in say, the United States. And I think that if we look at this in a very progressive way, then we begin to say, how come our brothers and sisters from West Africa or from the Caribbean who come here, sometimes limited with lack of education, maybe even limited with English skills, speaking skills, and yet they managed to survive by establishing among themselves businesses. Now, you go back, say, 30 years ago, you did not have African cab drivers in Harlem because you didn't have Africans in any large number in Harlem. Or you didn't have Africans doing hair braiding because they weren't here. But they came in because they had a culture in common, and their culture might be based on their ethnic identity, their Yoruba, or their Hausa, or the Igbo, or there's something else, and they stick together. And so they're able to make advancements. Whereas we've been here so long that we have a tendency to be individuals. So if I start a business, it may not last very long because I don't have the capital to sustain it.
Now, you raised some very good points, but just some might argue, okay, of course, when you talk about immigrants, there's something known as an immigrant ethos, where immigrants tend to work harder because of the fact that they don't have the different social advantages, the social service nets that someone who's born here might have in terms of social services. Now, but going back to the fact that we were back basically during segregation, because we were forced to, we didn't have those options to go to stores of people, places where people didn't look like that. So we did have to support one another. And we did have thriving communities. We did have, thriving businesses then. But as we decided that it was necessary to also ensure that we had access to everything under, civil rights, we explored civil rights, then people had more options, so instead of going to the historically black college, people went to other places, where you have an opportunity to go to stores that was owned by someone in the community. Now you can go to someone else outside the community. So we have a situation, as you said, where we're not we're not maybe sustaining certain businesses because we're not supporting one another the way we used to. And that's probably one of the biggest questions that comes up, particularly around this time of the year, where, we look at Kwanzaa, which is established to really support that whole coming together, that communalism and cooperative economics and, self-determination and all those principles. And we know that in December, as we're entering the holiday season, people are thinking that way. The question is, after these holidays, after whether it be Kwanzaa, whether it be Black Solidarity Day, and I know you've written about that, what happens? Why don't we have that same cultural
the reason again is some things are artificial. Kwanzaa is principles that were created back in the late 60s. You don't make an advancement by honoring or obeying, adhering to a principle for a short time period. For example, cooperative economics. Why isn't that preached every day of the year? See, Malcolm X said Harlem is poor because money doesn't stay in Harlem. I live in Harlem. When I buy my daily newspaper, or I get a can of soda, or I get a sandwich, I'm buying from someone who was born here. It came from another part of the world. In this case, it came from the Arabian Peninsula. If I go buy fruit in my neighborhood on the street, someone came from Bangladesh. Now, what they're doing is practicing without even knowing the principles of Kwanzaa, because, again, they have a common culture. For example, why is it when you go downtown in New York, where you go to Grand Central Station or Penn Station, Times Square area, and you want to buy a newspaper? I remember some years ago, and it may still be true today, the news dealers were Indians or Pakistanis, because a wealthy person of that origin had a chain of all these newspaper stands, and he would parcel them out to members of his own ethnic community. And so consequently, they're able to have jobs, maybe bring in a cousin, bring in a relative. Just for example, my neighborhood's bodega, people come from, they come from Yemen. I noticed the other day, there was a new person along with the old people. And I say old, who've been there for a while. I said, "Is that your cousin?" "Yeah, that's my cousin." So that's another immigrant who came here and walked right into a job. And one of the guys I know, Ali, was saying, "No, the price is that." He was telling them the price is something because he wasn't sure of the price. So that's a community together because they have a common culture, a common religion, common language, and so forth. If we escape that kind of connecting system, and we can't just say simply my color, because if I don't identify with you, then why should I give you my money? And that's what happens too often, is that Booker T. Washington talked about make people depend upon you the way you depend upon them. In other words, economic power. Mm-hmm. And we did that for a while. And then we kind of go away from it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you raised that question of learning those lessons from history. Okay, Booker T. Washington at the time. People have mixed feelings when you mention Booker T. Washington's name. Some think that he's a sellout or whatever. Some people realize that he had made some sense. Talk about that in terms of some of the lessons that we should be, lessons of history that we should have learned to propel our community to greater, because we do have billions of dollars amongst us, but the fact is it doesn't stay in our community, whereas in other communities, such as Asian communities, other communities, they recycle the dollars within their community. So it's not that we're a poor community as a totality, it's just that we're not keeping the money in our community. So what can we what strategies do you think, looking at history?
Well, you don't throw away a peach because there's a bruised spot. You cut away the bruised spot, or you don't eat it. So you don't throw away, say, Booker T. Washington's ideology about economic development because you may not agree with his views, say, on politics. So if he says, and he's established what was called the National Negro Business League in 1900, and his goal was to have chapters in all the major cities, and his goal was to try to dominate certain industries. For example, back then, before you had refrigeration, in the wintertime, you had people who go to the lakes where the water was fresh, and they cut out blocks of ice, and they'd be the ice sellers. And he said, dominate that because everybody needs ice at some point. See, everybody needs corn or wheat. So if you can dominate the agriculture, they have to come to you. But then if we get away from that kind of concept of, yes, we want to monopolize and dominate, the next thing we know, we're asking someone else for employment. And so you can have all these examples. And let me give you another example. Some years ago, and people should remember this because they probably participated, there were Koreans in the bodegas. And there were some concerns about how we were being treated by Korean merchants. To the point, people say boycott, boycott, boycott. And some people did. How many people boycotted? Maybe 20, 30, 40 people at a time, standing outside with signs like don't insult us and so forth. What happened? Eventually, those particular Koreans left that establishment. What's next? Empty building. 5, 6, 7, 8 months later, who's there? Some other Koreans. Now, why couldn't the people who boycotted say to themselves, what does it cost to run this establishment? How much money can we collectively put together so we can have it? How many people can work a shift so we have 24 hours? Because all the bodegas in Harlem are open 24 hours. Otherwise, they'll be long gone because they realize they have to stay open. So you bring your cousins, you bring your relatives in, and you keep the business going. So we don't do that. If we look at all our athletes, with all the money they earn, millions and millions of dollars, basketball, football, baseball, and so forth, and yet all of us who go to a luncheon or a banquet or a convention, it's white-owned hotels. Now, why don't we have our athletes, our millionaires, whether entertainment or athletic or whatever it is, why don't they get together and say, let's have at least one hotel in all these major cities that we can go to for our banquets and so forth? See, we don't have that stuff. But again, you go back to Booker T. Washington, see, make people depend upon you the way you depend upon them.
Mm-hmm. Now, in line with that whole concept of buy black, which is something that, we do hear it coming up, there are businesses, in our community that are establishments of catering halls, restaurants. And certainly I think the question is, do we know where these businesses are? Are we actively supporting them? Because the only way these businesses can stay open is if we support them. Now, it's been said that African Americans are brand loyal, meaning if, say, you go to a particular nail parlor and you like that nail for whatever reason, you're going to go there regardless of 10 or 15 that might be owned by somebody else. You want to go to that one. Or there's a brand of milk that you like that's a particular brand, you're going to stay. So I'm just wondering, is the brand loyalty or that mindset that some of us have where if we've been going to a certain place to get our car, to get our clothing, the interest in saying, okay, there's a brother or sister down the street that has a new shop that just opened up. Let's all go to that particular shop and let's keep this person going. So that I'm just thinking that terms of mindset there.
Okay, well, see, the two responses. One response is we automatically go to our own when it comes to getting your hair done, whether it's getting a perm or getting your hair cut. We don't even think about I'm going to go to this white barber somewhere. We automatically go to our own. But we don't think about going to our own if it means having an insurance policy, a doctor's visit, dentist visit, someone to do our taxes. Then we become more expansive and we go to anybody, everybody. Whereas other groups don't. I mean, if you take certain ethnic groups, without giving their specific names, if they're going to sell a home, they have a member of their ethnic group as a broker, a member of the ethnic group as the attorney, a member of the ethnic group to maybe get a bank loan. So they keep all that money basically within their own particular group, whereas we don't, because, see, again, what's our condition? If I don't think of myself as belonging to you, then I don't care whether I give you my money or give my money to someone else. And so consequently, we don't build up. And so what we have is, again, I think part of the reason, because we've been here so long, African Americans have been in the United States so long, that we don't think of ourselves as belonging particularly to a group. We think of ourselves belonging to ourselves. We're individuals. Individuals can't survive the way that members of a group can. So why is it when Africans come here, they already have an insurance policy where one dies, his body will be sent home. It's already arranged. So it's not a question of like, you might get any money, anybody got any money? They put money in advance because they know that the day is going to come when someone's going to die in their group. You got to put them on an airplane. You send them home.
So in line with that, as we kind of come to a conclusion, is when you look at, going back to the original question, culture and condition, what can we do? What strategies can we do to change that mindset, that we are more so into cultural understanding versus just condition, which is a kind of a temporary...
It's education. It's education. And I don't mean education in the sense of Monday to Friday in public schools. I mean education throughout. Other groups do it. Chinese kids learn Chinese on Saturdays because the parents understand the language is part of their culture, and that helps to unite them. If someone said, let's by the year 2075 have every African person, whether from the Caribbean or wherever they come from, speak a same language besides English. And you can pick any language you want, Swahili, Twi, Yoruba, whatever. Then we have something to identify with. If we say, I told my students one time, I said, I want you to take a little, take like a count of how you spend your money throughout the week. Besides like paying Con Ed or paying the telephone company, but where you buy your candy bar, where you buy your newspaper, where you buy your soda, and just jot down where you went. And at the end of the week, figure out how much money you spent and how much went to one of us compared to other people. And some did, and they were shocked because they said, wow, I didn't realize I spent so much money outside of my own group of people. Because we don't think that way. See, we don't think of, my group is going to survive if I help them survive, and they're going to fail if I don't help them survive.
Mm-hmm. And, just getting back to briefly as we kind of conclude this segment, you raised, in an article that you wrote several years ago, you talked about particular things such as Black Solidarity Day, which was very important, but I want to just give out a point real quick. You talked about the fact of, first of all, for those of a current generation who don't know what Black Solidarity Day is, because that's real. There's some people don't know what that is, don't even know it exists because we don't really practice it. Can we briefly tell them what that is and what we need to do in alignment with what you're suggesting?
I wrote that article just about a year after Black Solidarity Day was established. And Black Solidarity Day was an effort to make our economic power known. So the day before elections, so that'd be on a Monday, that people were told, don't go to work, don't go to school, don't shop unless it's an African-owned establishment. To me, it was a failure. So I wrote an essay, How Solid is Black Solidarity Day? Because from my perspective, historically, you can't do something on the whim. You can't say, well, let's do something next week without organizing and planning for this. And so just recently we had an election. There was the Black Solidarity Day. And again, how many people knew about this? There may be an event, people go and they buy some items, but it doesn't have a universal appeal. And because it's not organized and people are not given advance notice and don't have an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. Now, see, again, it takes time, it takes effort, and you can't just do it on a whim, and you can't say next week. You have to say, it's like people from the Caribbean, when do they start making their floats and costumes for Labor Day Carnival, or Carnival in the Caribbean? When do they start?
Right after the day.
The day after the event, they start planning their costumes, their floats, because they know it takes time to get organized. And so we kind of like that insight.
So I think, like, if I understand what you're saying correctly, and I appreciate what you said, is that we have to really strategize and really look at the situation, educate not just ourselves, but our children about the importance of supporting businesses in our community as we enter into the holiday season and into the new year, and certainly think about how important this is, particularly in the climate it is, where jobs opportunities are not always available to everyone, and how we can create jobs and create and sustain our community.
And see, you could do it if you had a council. If you say we want a representative from all the fraternities that we have, sororities that we have, all the civil rights groups that we have. If we had a council, and you might have 20, you might have 100 people, and they met on a regular basis, and they say, here's our agenda. And if our agenda is to have economic power in our own communities, then you develop the strategy. See, if our agenda is we want our children to have education beyond the public education, so we're going to establish these kinds of schools on a Saturday or say a Sunday, and we want our children to be able to understand who they are and understand their history. See, because it's all hit and miss. We have kids in public schools or private schools. Some schools are more progressive than others, and so kids get some of this information they should know. Others don't. And so consequently, if they don't know what Booker T. Washington said in 1900 about National Negro Business League, or they don't know what Garvey said about up ye mighty race, or if they don't know what Malcolm said about Harlem is poor because money doesn't stay in Harlem, then how do you expect to make any advances?
Well, on that note, I definitely left, as always, a lot of food for thought. And what do you think? We encourage the audience to really send us your feedback on what you've heard, and you can certainly send us information. Our email address, ccptv.org or ccptv2012@gmail.com. Again, ccptv2012@gmail.com if you have any comments about anything you've heard. And certainly we will continue to explore this.
Please do, because I'm 76 years old, and I don't want to be here on my 100th birthday saying the same thing.
Absolutely. So that's a challenge, folks. Let's get it together. But with that note, as always, we thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of Cultural Caravan, we hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. Let's welcome Joe Patan.
West Indian happy, happy whole time for Labor Day. I tell you, no problem, for we take over Harlem Sunday, eve of Labor Day. Virgin Islands crew in town, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. When you hear the